watch out, that your skin can bring you so much pain. Now I hear you say, you got the best of both ways. Won't you come and take a walk in my shoes and tell me if you take my place?
This week's guest is one of the most highly respected sports cardiologists in the world and a sub 2 hour 30 marathoner. He's the head of the Heart, Exercise and Research Trials Lab at St Vincent's Institute and the Victor Chang Cardiovascular Research Institute, as well as being a cardiologist and head of cardiovascular research at St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne. He completed a PhD at St Vincent's and University of Melbourne and 4 years of postdoctoral research at the University Hospital of Leuven in Belgium. His research and clinical work focuses on the effect of exercise on the human heart. He has more than 300 peer review publications and textbook chapters, serves on multiple international guideline statements, and is regularly invited to present at all major international cardiology conferences. A huge welcome to the Inside Running podcast, Professor Andre Gerche.
G'day, Brad. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack in that intro, and I'm guessing you don't have a lot of spare time.
I suppose not, but enough time to sort of stay active, I guess.
Yeah, and so you must giggle a little bit when you're running down there on the surf coast with Moose, and he's trying to tell everybody how busy he is.
Yeah, that is true. Even just this last weekend we were running, and he was telling me that I wouldn't know what it's like to live a busy life, but certainly he would be the gold standard in terms of the busiest person on the planet. But yeah, relative to him, I'm a little bit busy.
It sounds like Moose, but yeah, thank you so much for giving up some time. I think this has been a long time coming. I know we've been sort of in discussions about doing this interview even back when I was having all of my heart issues. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, and I'm sure our listeners can learn a lot.
Yeah, hopefully I can give some good advice that people can that is understandable.
Yeah. So I think it'd be rude not to actually address your own athletic achievements. So there's not that many people that run sub 2 hour 30 for the marathon, and I didn't mention it in the intro, but you're also a fairly high level Ironman triathlete. Competed in Kona, and was it 1996? You were the fourth Aussie there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
It was definitely 1996. I think that's right. I was fourth Australian.
Do you know where you finished overall?
I think I was 59th or thereabouts. But I was one of the youngest in the race. I was 22 years of age. Just like so many people, just young, mad, and obsessed.
Yeah. And so, how did you get into endurance sports? Was it something you did at school, or not until university?
Mainly university. I sort of swam as a kid, and then I did slalom kayaking as a teenager. And then the last few years of school sort of concentrated on studies and didn't do much. And then when I got to university, really kind of quite suddenly and obsessively got into triathlon. Absolutely loved it. Became one of those triathletes that no one likes to be around because that's all they talk about. And I think within 2-3 years, I was sort of training up and doing the Ironman triathlon in Hawaii, which I absolutely loved and planned to go back but never have. And then after that, sort of found that running was sort of slotted in and filled most of those passions, but was so much more time efficient and simple. I kind of loved turning up at running races where all you needed was a pair of runners and a singlet, and sort of seemed a very humble sport that I just loved.
How'd you juggle Ironman training with study? Because from what I understand, people that are competing at that level in Ironman triathlon, it's 20-30 hours a week of training?
Yeah, and I really trained. Back then I was just obsessed. And so it's a very good question, because the answer would be I hardly did. I mean, I still remember days when I'd get up at 4:30 in the morning, ride to swimming training, do swimming, then do a bike ride, and then go to uni and then do a run. And looking back, and I kept a really kept a diary, which I look back at and can't really believe I did it. But I was truly obsessed. It was just, life was all about triathlon and study, and probably somewhere toward after Hawaii, my emphasis switched from triathlon more towards study. Part of me thinks the reason I became a sort of cardiologist and sports cardiologist was as a failed athlete. I just at some point realised it just wasn't good enough. But the other thing is, I truly did, I know this sounds corny, but I did sort of fall in love with or become intrigued by medicine and by cardiology. It does sound corny, but it sort of is true. I really sort of became intrigued somewhere there, sort of mid-20s.
Yeah. So what we normally do when we have athletes on the show and we interview them, we normally go through their PB. So you do actually have a World Athletics profile, but it says you're from Belgium, and there's not a lot of results on there. So Brett Coleman helped me out a little bit. He reckons, so we'll start maybe with 3K. I believe it's around 9 minutes flat. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's exactly correct. It's like 9:00.10 or something. It was hilarious. Very hot night on the track, and all I had to do was run the last lap under sort of split, just accelerate even slightly, less than 72 seconds or something for 400, and I couldn't do it. And I ran, like a hair's breadth over 9 minutes, nearly killed me anyway. Yeah. Yep. So that's 3K.
What year was that?
Oh, geez. Probably 2007-ish.
Yeah. And just a AV race?
It was an AV race. Yep.
Yeah.
But it was in the evening, and it was like 40 degrees that day. It was crazy. And there were only about 4 of us who did it. But anyway.
So 2007, so this is like 11 years after your sort of peak Ironman period. So do you think you would have run better back when you were doing the Ironman stuff, or you're running better 11 years later?
I was running better, 11 years. I was running better later, probably, 3K and some of those things, but certainly in half marathons and marathons, the more time I did, the better. Because triathlon, it's slightly different running. Sort of triathlon, sort of like strong running, like having a bit left. And running is, fast running, I'd call it.
Yeah. 5K PB?
5K, I think, is 15:15. Not exactly sure.
It's moving, yep. And 10K?
10K was in Antwerp on the road, and it was accurate at 31:20. That's the fastest I ever ran.
Yep. And then the half marathon, I believe, was 70:30 at Burnley half in 2007, where you're part of the Geelong cross-country team. They won their first ever XCR premiership after Glenn Huntley won 10 years straight.
Correct.
Yeah.
That'd be close to my career highlight, was winning the cross-country state relay with 4 what I'd call also rans, and then we had Lee Troop and Craig Mottram in the team. So we had a couple of Olympians and Commonwealth Games and World Championships between us in the team. Let's say it that way.
Do you remember who the other members were of the team?
Yeah, there was Michael. What's his name? I'm forgetting his surname. Brett Coleman, myself, and I'm also forgetting. Got a picture, but not a name. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to. Right. But it was really funny because we all ran within about 10 seconds, and then Troopy ran like 2 minutes quicker, and Craig another minute. It was unbelievable. We would have been not last but close to, and instead we won it. It was brilliant.
Sounds similar to the year that Brady was in the same team as Mottram. It's like, Mottram does all the work. And then the marathon, I had a look at your profile, and you've done quite a few of the big ones around the world, like Berlin, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Paris, jumped Boston twice.
Yep.
Yeah, and so PB 2:29.
2:29.29.
Yep. And that one was at
Frankfurt.
Yeah. Okay. And because I
ran about 6 of them between 2:30 and 2:32. Like it was an absolute kind of frustration to get under 2:30, and I just kept missing out very slightly. Like one in Paris, one in Berlin, one in one in Brussels, blah 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 blah. Yeah. But could never crack it, and then finally in Frankfurt.
And what sort of mileage, because you're obviously working full time, like doing these, like what sort of mileage would you run a week to run sub 2:30?
So back there, it's been a bit worse over the last couple of years, but back then my sort of standard week was sort of in about the 110 range, and then for the 3 months leading up to a marathon, I'd build and I'd get to about 140 to 150. I don't think I've ever run a week over 150, but it would sort of get in that territory.
And was it the traditional sort of Australian system of 3 sessions, like Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday session, Sunday long run, Wednesday midweek run, or a bit different?
So I once ran, I reckon, the best that I was ever running. It seems funny talking about this when I truly sort of amateur, but still people might find that, everyone's got their different way. And I once got super fit for me, and went into the Amsterdam Marathon and was running good, 5K times, etc., and went in, ran way too fast for the first half and just exploded. And I sort of thought, I'm giving up this. It was just an awful race. I hated it. And then I bought this book called Advanced Marathoning, which took an entirely different approach to sort of doing sessions and running fast, and was kind of essentially get used to running fast, boring kilometres. That idea that in the last 10K of a marathon, your legs just feel sort of tired from going at a fast but not super fast pace. And so it's just a lot of sort of boring, kind of flat stuff. And I found that incredibly helpful. Although over the last few years I got so sort of bored of that now I like going back into the hills and mixing it up a bit. Yep. But I found that quite interesting, that sort of change to more marathon-specific training.
And I reckon you might be able to help the listeners out here because, you're still running really well. So 2023, you won the over 50 category at Melbourne Marathon, running 2:36, which is still super impressive. How has your training changed as you've gotten older, and what are you finding sort of more difficult now compared to say 10, 15 years ago?
I reckon everyone over the age of 40 and certainly over 50 will relate to this, that the thing that changes is you just recover so much slower. What I used to sort of pull up within a day is now 2-3 days. And one thing I've found is that I don't tolerate training sort of blocks for a long period of time. So I'll stay consistent. I reckon the themes are you've got to be consistent, because if you just do 20K one week and 90 the next, you will be injured and you won't improve. But so I just generally in that sort of 70, 80, sort of 90 kilometre zone, try to do that week in, week out, and then keep any sort of lead up to a race to sort of 3 to tops 4 months of build. Because if it's any longer than that, I find I either just don't cope or just get slower.
Yeah. And anything changed in terms of have you had to dial back intensity or anything like that?
Probably maybe a little bit, but the thing that's changed is I don't do many really dedicated sessions until close to a race, and do a lot more sort of just running in the hills. I don't know that that's really to improve things. It's just because of I kind of love it. It's a good way of combining social, running with friends and et cetera, et cetera. It's just a way of keeping it interesting.
Yeah. And any races that are on your bucket list over the next few years?
So I'm going to do the European Running Championships, at least hopefully, if all goes well, at the start of April, partly because it runs from Brussels to Leuven, which is where I lived and where I worked a few years ago. So it's a bit of nostalgia. So I'm looking forward to that.
Very good. All right. Now it's time for me to bombard you with a heap of questions relating to the heart. Before we do, just a question, because you've competed at a pretty high level, do you think you manage patients differently to some other cardiologists because you're an athlete and you know how addictive and enjoyable endurance sports can be?
I think I do. And so there's a few facets to that. One is that, again, it sounds a bit sort of cliched, but I think athletes do understand athletes, and just the interest you take in it. I remember reading this book about sort of sports psychology, and the description of the little voice in the head. You're running along and the little voice says, "Oh, should you be doing this?" Or, "What's that? Should you pull back?" And a lot of when I talk to patients, I sort of say, whatever the tests are, for example, if everything's reassuring, I sort of say, if that little voice says, "Are you okay? Should you be pulling back?" And the answer is, "I'm fine, and no, I don't need to." Or, variations of that. And often athletes go, "Oh, yeah, okay," because there is that inner voice and that inner question. And whereas some cardiologists might say, I think you're okay, or some language like that, we put a lot more emphasis in our clinic on being somewhat black and white. When we're sure, we say you are absolutely okay, because the worst thing for an athlete is to be left with doubt, to be going along and sort of going, oh, I don't know, my doctor isn't sure, whatever. So some of those things. And then in terms of some of the advice of sports-specific training, it's much easier when you know about running or triathlon or whatever to be able to relate to the sport and to some of the symptoms. So I think it is very helpful. On the other side, I am constantly aware that everyone brings their own bias to everything, but to medicine. And I often say to patients, I have a bit of a bias because I love sport and because I think it's so important for health that I will tend to, recommend exercise where other cardiologists might not. And I always then try to think about, is that rational? Am I being safe? Am I being kind of evidence-based? But as I say, it's definitely a bias that I'm aware of, and I tell patients that because I think they do need to know that on the scale of, or on the spectrum of advice that people will receive, I'm often more pro-exercise or a bit more liberal than other cardiologists might be.
But one thing I did notice when I was having my issues was, like, if you did reach out to some of your colleagues as well, and then, what do you think? And then I remember it was just before Gold Coast Marathon. So I was diagnosed the week before and I still wanted to go up there and run. And I think you had spoken to one of your colleagues, and then you called me and like, yeah, look, I think you're better off just sitting on the sidelines for this one.
Yeah, and it's something that in sports cardiology we do quite a bit, because there's a few reasons. One's very selfish, which is that, like absolutely everything in life, none of us are 100%, guarantees. And so to make sure we make the best possible decision, and also so that you're not carrying all of the psychological burden yourself, I often turn to colleagues and say, what do you think? And if we've got an agreed position, then we all sort of, carry, if you like, the psychological risk. And there's some conditions where, some of the what we call cardiomyopathies, where patients are at a greater risk of serious things happening, including dying suddenly. And there's nothing that we can do that 100% sort of fixes that. And so if you treat enough people, something bad's going to happen at some point. And I often think about that and think about how I'll feel, because it's, of course, as the doctor, you never feel as bad as the patient or the family, etc. But you still carry a lot of you go on the journey with the patients. Yeah. So I like to share it, one with colleagues, one to make sure best decision making, and the other is to sort of have a few people around the table.
Yeah. All right. So first question, I might start with a broad one. So during my intro, I said that a lot of your researchers looked at the impact of exercise on the human heart. So I think that's probably a good place to start. So what are those impacts, both, I guess, positive and negative? I know that's a pretty broad question.
Yeah. So when we talk about heart health and cardiology, I often, just to sort of broadly categorize it, think about the heart in terms of its three main things. And they are the electrics of the heart, the function of the heart and its capacity, and then lastly, sort of the plumbing or arteries to the heart. The last one being particularly important because it's the most common cause of what we call heart attack. But if I was to break those down broadly, and we can discuss each of those, but in terms of the electrics, there are some things about endurance exercise and lifelong endurance exercise that we believe, there's good evidence now that it increases the risk of some heart rhythm problems. Some, like atrial fibrillation, which is one of the more common heart rhythm problems that is a nuisance rather than a sort of life-threatening condition. But that is clearly more common in endurance athletes than the general population. So from an electrics point of view, not all electrical things, but some of them, exercise can make those more likely. Function is almost the opposite. In almost every condition, exercise improves heart function. It makes the heart the engine. It makes the engine bigger. It makes it fill The heart has two main functions, to fill and to eject blood. It fills better and it ejects better. So whereas a normal person with every beat might pump 50 mils, some of our elite athletes will pump 3 times that with every heartbeat, 3-4 times that. And so it's, the function of the heart with exercise improves. It's just one of the biggest pluses. And in some ways, I see it as almost the most important plus, because I see a lot of older athletes who might run into some issues with electrical problems, but are still functioning so much better than the average person because of the functional ability. They're the ones running up the stairs with their groceries at the age of 85. So I think that's a major plus. And then in terms of plumbing, that's one of the more interesting and controversial ones, because we've always thought that exercise prevents or reduces the chance of having a heart attack and stroke, and it seems that remains true. Exercise and exercise training seems to make the arteries less likely to clot off, which is what causes a heart attack. But the thing that's interesting and has become a bit controversial is that over the last few years, research from around the world, including some of our own research, has shown that that athletes are in fact more likely to have gunk in their arteries, but then less likely to have a heart attack. So strangely, it increases things like a coronary calcium score that we might get to, but it seems to reduce the chance of that then actually sort of clotting off or causing inflammation and causing the blood to block off. So it's a bit of a funny one, the plumbing, and it actually becomes really important because athletes come along with a coronary calcium score that's really elevated and say, what do I do? And the short answer is you should keep exercising, but we might be able to discuss that some more.
Yeah, well, let's discuss that bit now. So, who should go and get a calcium, or when should you go and get a calcium score?
So it's a good question and a bit of a tricky one. So the really clear cut, the best use of a coronary calcium score is if you go to your GP or your cardiologist and you check your blood pressure, your cholesterol, you put in your age and a number of things. And if it comes up that you should be thinking about cholesterol treatment, then a coronary calcium score can be a really helpful way of refining that decision. Because if you have mildly elevated cholesterol and you're on blood pressure tablets, but your coronary calcium score is 0, meaning you don't have any evidence of coronary disease, then there's a very good rationale for not going on cholesterol treatment. On the other hand, if your cholesterol's a bit up, your blood pressure, etc., and you have a coronary calcium score and it's over 100, then I'd be relatively banging the table saying you will really benefit from cholesterol tablets.
Sorry, go on, continue.
The one that's a bit trickier is the person, like a lot of the people who will be listening, who are like myself, who are sort of middle-aged and have a low risk. The blood pressure is normal. You do your cholesterol and it's normal or within normal ranges. So overall, your risk is low. Then the problem is, do you have a calcium score? Because if you get one done and it's elevated, it's not as clear that being on any form of treatment like cholesterol tablets will make a difference, or at least will make a big difference. So, for example, I'm 51 years of age and I haven't had a coronary calcium score because I'm not sure that the answer will greatly change what I do. And I'm a bit worried that, and this is just my personality, but I'm a bit worried that if it was significantly elevated, that it might dampen my enjoyment of running when there's not much I can do about the result. I have a lot of colleagues who would, say very differently to that, and that knowledge is power, and that you can, that at least you know the result and you can deal with it. And I think a lot of that comes down to personality. And so I discuss it with people before they have the test, because I've seen people get very anxious because of the result. And I've seen other people who really find it very valuable to know exactly where they're at, and then they can do what they want to do about it, even if it doesn't change things that much.
Yeah. And while we're on the plumbing side of things, so if people don't go and get their cholesterol checked or their blood pressure checked, are there any sort of, other than having a heart attack and sort of dropping dead or, you know, becoming unconscious, are there any symptoms that you should be aware of that would indicate going and seeing a doctor because of a plumbing related issue?
Yeah. So you know, high cholesterol and high blood pressure do not have symptoms. So they're kind of silent risk factors, and the only way of knowing what yours is to go and get them checked. On the other hand, if you've got a build-up of gunk in the arteries, then that can cause symptoms because it can limit the blood flow to the heart, and if the heart's not getting enough blood flow, then it tends to cause symptoms, which often can be sort of chest heaviness or pressure, left arm pressure, or it can manifest just as sort of exercise intolerance. You know, I used to be able to run up that hill. Now I get halfway up and something really drags me back. You get some interesting sort of symptoms. So I think one message, let's say two messages. One is to get your risk factors checked because they're silent. You know, I think every middle-aged guy and woman, so from about the age of 50, should know their cholesterol and should know their blood pressure. But then any symptom where, for athletes, where you feel like you've lost a cylinder or you know, something is not right when you exercise, and athletes tend to know their body, then they should get it checked out. And, you know, 90% of the time that checkout will involve reassurance. You know, it's all okay, but you don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah. All right, let's move across to the arrhythmias now, because I know when I was having my issues, I was getting lots of messages from people saying, oh, I know this person had an arrhythmia, they had an ablation, they're back training. So there's so many different arrhythmias, like what generally causes them and what's the difference between a nuisance arrhythmia and a potentially deadly arrhythmia?
Yeah, so arrhythmias can either, so it can cause a range of symptoms. People can feel sort of sudden fast heartbeats, or you know, a very common symptom that we see in athletes with arrhythmias is they're going along and they're feeling fine, and then click of the fingers, it feels like they've, you know, lost a cylinder, like they just really feel flat. And then 10 seconds later, click of the fingers and they feel fine again, or a minute later or whatever. And that may occur with a feeling that their heart's racing, but sometimes without. But when we do hear those symptoms of really sudden on and off, it does make us think about heart rhythm problems. Some people will feel like that their heart's racing, and one of the indicators, and it's a good question about when is it safe and when is it really serious. It can be hard to tell from the symptoms alone, but certainly if people get palpitations and they feel very lightheaded, or if they pass out, or if they really feel like they've suddenly dropped 3-4 cylinders, or if they get any chest pain, they're real red flags where we would quite urgently want to see that athlete and assess what's going on, because we don't truly know what's going on until we capture the rhythm when it's happening. And there's a whole range of things that it could be, and things like what we call SVT, supraventricular tachycardia, atrial fibrillation. These arrhythmias that come from the top chambers of the heart, they're virtually always benign. They're a nuisance, but they don't cause people to lose cardiac output. They're not arrhythmias that cause people to die suddenly. Whereas arrhythmias that come from the ventricles, they're not all, but they can be very serious, and they're the ones we really, you know, sort of look at very carefully, because they can be very fast and they can be unstable, which means that they can go into what's called ventricular fibrillation. And ventricular fibrillation is just when there's no meaningful, it just sort of fibrillates rather than beats. And that that's the sort of thing that occurs just before people have a cardiac arrest or die suddenly.
Yeah.
So broadly speaking, SVT, atrial fibrillation, things from the top of the heart are safe, and things from the bottom we take very seriously.
Yeah. And are there certain people that are at higher risk? Like, do the arrhythmias start at particular ages? Is it based on how much training they've done in the past, what age they started, exercising? What are the factors there that contribute to high risk of arrhythmias? Gender?
So let's start with gender. That's really important because for reasons we don't understand, almost all arrhythmias, including some of the safe ones like atrial fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, and cardiac arrest, are about 5 times less common in women. Women have more stable hearts. We don't understand why, but they are less at risk of serious arrhythmias. Then in terms of young, old, in the general population, serious arrhythmias increase with age. And things like ventricular tachycardia tend to occur in older patients that have heart muscle damage. In young endurance athletes, that can be different. So if I normally would see a young person who has rapid palpitations, then I would be thinking of VT at the bottom of the list. Where if I see a professional cyclist or an endurance runner and they have rapid palpitations and don't feel well, then I'm really keen to exclude VT because it is something that we see, and it does seem to be more common in endurance athletes.
Yeah, okay.
Important to point out that, things, the safe, or nuisance arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, they're relatively common, or at least they're not rare. So we're talking about sort of 10% of people in their 70s and 80s would have AF. People in their 30s and 40s, it might be 1 or 2%, but it's still not that uncommon. Whereas VT is sort of 1 in a few thousand type thing. They are really uncommon. But in young endurance athletes, we do start to think about it because it seems to be more common than we'd expect in the general population.
I was watching one of your presentations where you brought up a list of athletes that had ventricular tachycardia, like your Emma Carneys and your Greg Welsh's. And one thing you said there that a lot of the people that have ventricular tachycardia have some scarring on the heart. Is that a common thing amongst people with VT? And like, how does scarring come about?
Yeah, so there does seem to be a clear association between scar and arrhythmias. Certainly, it's one of the things we look at when we're trying to work out whether the arrhythmia is serious and how serious. Is looking for scar, and the way we do that is using specialised imaging like cardiac magnetic resonance imaging. We give some contrast and see if there's any little patches of white that indicate scar in the heart muscle. It's interesting when you mention those athletes again, because part of the reason I became interested in this area is when I was doing triathlon, there was this whole cluster of, Bruce Thomas, Greg Welch, Emma Carney, all these people who, some of which I knew, who were, developing these life-threatening arrhythmias. And it just, for things that in that age group are extremely uncommon, they seem to be common amongst that group. And that's one of the things that we've found in our research is that they're more common. So to come back to the question, scar it's clearly more common in athletes than in the general population. So if we do MRI scans, we find scar in our studies in around about 15 to 20% of middle-aged endurance athletes. Some of the studies overseas have suggested it can be as many as 40, 50%. Depends on, how sensitive you are to tiny little patches or not. But, what I'd call sort of meaningful little bits of scar, it's, 1 in 10, 1 in 5 athletes will have that. The thing is that the people who then have serious heart rhythm problems is more 1 in 1,000. So an important thing there is if any athlete has an MRI for whatever reason, they're told they've got scar, it doesn't necessarily mean they're in trouble. Scar's relatively common, but the association of ventricular ventricular extra beats or ventricular arrhythmias with scar, that's something we take pretty seriously.
Yeah. And do we know how this scarring comes about, which I guess leads on to my next question, like the heart's a muscle. Can you overtrain the heart? And if you can overtrain the heart, what are the symptoms?
Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why people think that scar might occur. There's probably three main sort of hypotheses or theories. One is a genetic theory. So people have inborn or family traits that make them more likely to have heart rhythm problems. The second one is that people have some sort of illness. COVID, of course, made this sort of highlighted the fact to people that viruses can affect the heart, but there's actually lots of viruses that can affect the heart. So one theory is that athletes train all the time and maybe training when they're sick has caused some scarring. The third one, which I think is a really important one, is mechanical sort of forces. Like when we study the heart and when we study it during exercise, it fills with blood, and the changes in that sort of stretching of the heart, and when being pushed around by breathing, etc. There's a lot of forces on the heart during exercise. And one theory that we have, which seems to be make some sense, is that when you're exercising, the heart rubs quite vigorously up against the chest wall and the lungs. And, if you run a marathon, for example, you put Vaseline under your arms and wherever, because you'll get some sort of friction and some rash. And one of our theories is that actually can occur to the heart. And maybe there's some people that are more prone to that. We can't completely work that out, but the part of the reason we think that is a reasonable theory is that the area that we see the arrhythmias comes from the sites where the heart is in most contact with the chest bone at the front and the spine at the back. And so that's one thing that we're really working on, whether this could be a contact sort of issue. And then, is it overtraining? It's really hard to separate one out from the other, because if you're doing more training, if your heart is bigger because of the training, a lot of these things could sort of interact with any of those theories, could make the gene theory more likely, could make the infection theory more likely, could make the rubbing. So they're all going to be sort of training and athlete related. That's why we believe we see these arrhythmias more in athletes. I suppose one other thing that I haven't mentioned here is that one thing that occurs in all athletes is that the heart gets bigger, and it gets bigger fairly much in proportion with fitness. So if you've got a VO2 of 80, you have a very big heart. If you have a VO2 of 40, then your heart's not going to be very big unless there's something wrong with it. And so, the more you train, the fitter you get, the larger your heart. And generally that's a very healthy thing, and it definitely improves the function that I mentioned right at the beginning. But one of the possibilities is that the bigger the heart, the more likely it is to the bigger the mechanical forces and the more it can rub against structures and these sort of things, which might be one of the things contributing to these arrhythmias and heart rhythm problems.
Yeah. All right. Next question's in regards to the type of training and I guess its impact on the heart. So I guess I'm talking about is going out and doing a high intensity training session worse or better for the heart than, say, a 6-7 hour ride at 130 beats a minute versus a really long sustained tempo?
So the first thing to say here is a lot of that my subsequent answer will be our best guess, because we don't truly know. There are some things that we know pretty well, and that is that low intensity exercise like walking, even brisk walking, hiking, those things have pretty minimal impact on the heart, and you can do them for as long as you like. Similarly, we know, or we think we know, that gym training and strength training has minimal or no impact on the heart, and people can do that as much as they like. The rubber hits the road with moderate or intense exercise, and our sort of best guess or our evidence based on when we do things like exercise MRI, we see the heart get bigger and fill with more and more blood up until about time trial pace or sort of ventilatory threshold. And then it actually gets a bit smaller again because it just doesn't, because the heart rate's so fast, it doesn't have enough time to fill. But what we think is the, if you like, most problematic exercise in terms of heart rhythm problems is long time trial efforts. So people on the bike that get on and go as hard as they can for 3-4 hours, or in running terminology, if you were running sort of, kind of marathon pace for all of your runs and as much as you can, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but it sort of is, because it's not the smartest way to train, one. And secondly, it probably is the worst way of training in terms of heart rhythm problems. So if we turn that round, and it's interesting because a lot of modern training seems to be, a lot of the pro cyclists are now doing more low intensity, longer exercise and shorter high intensity exercise, and doing less work where they combine the two. Even though racing might involve combining the two, training they either do long and slow or fast and short. And there's a lot of, from cardiovascular sort of health, there's a lot of sense to that, because the heart tolerates short, high intensity well, and it tolerates long and slow well. The biggest stress, if you like, on the heart is fairly hard, or really quite hard, for long periods of time.
Yeah. And in terms of as you get older, should athletes change the way they train? Is it more dangerous for somebody in their mid to late 50s to be going out doing hard sessions? Should they get to a point in life where you go, okay, I just need to dial things back and just be aerobic?
I don't think so. What I do think is that as you get older, you really need to be aware that, the risk of heart attack, of gunk in the artery suddenly clotting off and causing damage to the heart muscle, and that can cause electrical problems, etc. That risk increases with age. And so, I'm 50, so now I really think that I could have a heart attack. And you can't be so fit as to, there's no insurance policy for heart attack. You can reduce the risk, but I can still have a heart attack. So what I do is try, if I'm doing less training and want to increase it, I do it gradually, because that means that there's more of a chance that I'll pick up some symptoms without it being too much of a stress on the system. So I think as you get older, you need to be more consistent and make changes more gradually. But there shouldn't be, there's still no limit on that. If you train up sensibly, you can go as hard as you like. It's not like I'm now 60, therefore I should limit things to 80%. In fact, if anything, I sort of think as we get older, probably a few things become more important. Things like strength training to prevent injuries and just for overall function. As much as I find that boring to do gym training, I think it does become more important as we get older. And I think that short, hard training is still really important as we get older. It's just that, you just can't do them out of the blue, or at least if you do, you're taking on a little bit of risk. You haven't been doing anything for a month and your friends say, tomorrow we're going mountain biking, and you can go mountain biking, but don't go all out, because you do take on a little bit of risk.
Likewise, old calves and Achilles don't like speed work either.
It's exactly. So if you think about your heart as like an Achilles tendon, the worst thing you can do for your calves is to be unfit and then go out and do, 8 400s flat out. If you think about your heart the same way, it doesn't mean you can't do 8 400s flat out, but don't do that out of the blue.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, it's all actually pretty common sense, but we don't think about our hearts, and our hearts don't necessarily complain. sometimes until it's too late. So you do need to think about it and sort of, make all training graduations more gradual, more boring as we get older.
And when would you suggest people go and get seen to about like arrhythmias? Like if you have like one sort of period where you feel like your heart's beating quick, a bit of shortness of breath, and it happens once, is that enough to warrant going to the doctor? And is it common for people to have that, but then never actually get diagnosed because they don't have the arrhythmia while they're being tested? Like I was obviously lucky that, I had some symptoms. I didn't go to the doctor straight away. I only went to the doctor once I was wearing the heart rate strap and I knew that something was clearly not right. And then I came down and saw you for testing and I actually had an arrhythmia while I was having the testing. But is it common for people not to get a diagnosis?
It is. So the red flags, when should people go to the doctor and to a cardiologist? The red flags would be any episode of rapid palpitations during exercise, even if it's once off, particularly if those palpitations are associated with feeling flat, short of breath, lightheaded, or not right. They really should be seen. If we go the other end, the things that I think people can feel reassured by and they don't have to rush to the doctor is it's very common when you're just at rest to feel like you've missed or skipped a beat. About up to 5% of the population will fairly frequently feel sort of little extra beat or two or feel like the heart missed a beat. And if they feel all right the rest of the time and it's occurring when they're sitting watching TV, that's common and not of concern and certainly not something that needs to be seen urgently. But anything that causes someone to feel lightheaded, short of breath, not right, and particularly if it occurs during exercise, then they should see their doctor even if it occurs once. Now, if it does occur once, there's a very good chance that you see the cardiologist and they mightn't be able to capture what that was. But we can with testing work out with some fairly simple tests like an ECG and an ultrasound of the heart whether everything is okay or at least okay enough to keep going. But that might also mean that we sort of reassure someone but say, I still want to try to work out what's going on.
Yeah.
Then we have a whole lot of devices that can help us capture what's going on.
Yeah, so going back now to the bit where, if people have COVID or a sickness and they train, there's a chance then of getting some inflammation in the heart. So when should people run and not run around sickness?
So the things I would say that are sort of red flag, or the times I wouldn't train, would be if you've got a fever or you feel absolutely terrible. Partly because of heart health, partly because you're not going to get any benefit out of the session anyway. I mean, I think all too often as athletes, we just become obsessed with the process rather than the results. And if you feel absolutely miserable, the session's just probably going to make your recovery slower and feel terrible. The problem with athletes is more the grey zone. You feel a little bit not great, but you don't know if you've got a bit of a cold or you've got a mild cold. And if you didn't train for any of those, you probably miss, 10, 20 days a year, and that could have been good sessions. So my rule for that, which is probably a bit more of a personal thing, is if I'm not too sick and I just feel a bit flat, I'll often go out and start a training session and then see how it feels. Because sometimes you feel not quite right, you start running and you actually feel perfectly fine. 2-3K into it, you're like, oh, this, and it's almost like it cures you. But other times you run and you just feel terrible, and I pull up early.
Because you've probably heard the old endurance athlete. There's the rule going around: if it's above the neck, you're fine, train. If it's below the neck, don't train.
Yeah.
Any truth in that one?
Well, I think it's so below the neck, meaning if you're sort of feeling sort of generally miserable or you've got sort of a cough or coughing up garbage, or if you've got a fever, it probably is pretty sensible, because a lot of the stuff, if you like, above the neck is your common cold and not too bad. And I don't think that I think it's reasonable to train through those.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of sense to that. Yeah. Because, there's always a bit of common sense required.
Yeah. Got a couple of like just general talking points, which thanks to your mate, Brett Coleman, for sending these ones through. So what is sudden cardiac death and how common is it? And I guess how's it different to what we've sort of been chatting about?
Yeah, so sudden cardiac death is like when someone has been well and then kind of out of the blue they have usually either a heart attack, so a blocked vessel, or an arrhythmia, and that results in them dying suddenly due to a heart rhythm problem. And it's uncommon, but not as rare as we'd think. So for people under the age of 50, guys more than women, but still in both, it is the most common cause to die or to die suddenly. And so, it's to give you an idea, it's about 1 in 50,000 males under the age of 50, and it's about 3 times more common than dying due to a car accident. And people find that often people will find that a surprise because, there's lots of advertisements on TV about car crashes and slowing down and road safety, but there's not much awareness about, the risk of dying suddenly due to heart problems. And so we're trying to increase the awareness around Australia because there are ways in which you can prevent that. At the moment, one of the problems is that we don't have any perfect ways of preventing it, but some of the things that I discussed earlier, like that middle-aged people should have their blood pressure and cholesterol checked, that's a start. It will identify people at greater risk. What we would love to do over the decades ahead is to be able to identify people who are at lower risk. We all hear about athletes and non-athletes in society who die suddenly either when they're just at home sleeping or during a sporting event. And it occurs more frequently than we'd like, and it's an absolute disaster for families, etc. So, it's a major health issue that I don't think we've addressed enough.
Yeah. And so you mentioned about Shane Warne earlier. So obviously all of the Australian listeners and probably the UK listeners would be aware of Shane Warne, famous cricketer. He had a heart attack. Do we know what was the cause of that?
So Shane Warne had a cardiac arrest due to a heart attack, so due to a blocked heart vessel, which from about the age of 30 is the most common reason for having sudden cardiac death, is due to a blocked heart vessel. Where I'm a little bit critical of the public health response to the Shane Warne scenario is that a lot of it has been, if he had had a heart check, we would have prevented him from dying suddenly. I wish we were that good as doctors, but we're not there yet. And I think that that's where a lot of research is required because, I suspect, and I don't know all of Shane Warne's details, but it wouldn't at all be surprised. Let me put it this way. When we've looked at people who have died suddenly of a heart attack in Victoria under the age of 50, 2/3 of them have no or only one cardiac risk factor. So their cholesterol's normal, their blood pressure's normal, they're perfectly healthy, and they have a heart attack. And I suspect that was probably true or true-ish of Shane Warne. So whilst I said before it's important to get your blood pressure and cholesterol checked, and it is important because it can identify risk, it won't get anyone. It, in fact, won't even get close. So we've got a lot of work to do to try to prevent more people from having cardiac arrests. Another important way is for people to, if they get any symptoms, to go and see a doctor. But again, that in fact is a relative minority of patients that then go on to have a heart attack. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of, looking for genes, looking for different reasons as to why people might have a heart attack. But I think we've really, our job as doctors and researchers is to keep trying because, it's the worst part of my practice to be sitting with a family who are saying, why did my brother, why did my, more often is a male, why did my son, whatever, die suddenly?
Yeah. And so if somebody does have like coronary artery disease, like is it safe for them to exercise?
Yes. So the best thing yes, with a little bit of a caveat. So, and I should have mentioned this with the coronary artery calcium scores, because if you have coronary disease and you have no symptoms, so you don't get any chest pain or any limitation during exercise, then not only is it safe, but it's even one of the treatments. So the risk of heart attack in people with coronary disease, i.e. meaning, that there's gunk there, but it's not causing blockages, then doing exercise reduces the risk of heart attack, and quite dramatically, probably even more so than cholesterol tablets. So it's a very important treatment. Where people do have to be careful is that in people with gunk in the arteries, the most likely time to have a heart attack is during exercise. We call that the exercise paradox, that exercise prevents you from having a heart attack, but at the same time, the most common time to have a heart attack is during exercise. And the way of sort of addressing that paradox is to be consistent in your exercise and to make changes in intensity gradual. There used to be this idea of the midweek businessman's syndrome, where they'd do no exercise and then they'd have a hard game of squash on a Wednesday and have a heart attack. That's what you want to avoid. You want to be playing a bit of squash every day or a bit of whatever, so that anything you do, if you think of your heart as having a brain, it sort of goes, okay, I'm running for the bus. This is within my hitting arc. Yep. Whereas if you're really unfit and you run for the bus, you're at risk. Or if you're fit and you go and do a 5K run out of the blue flat out, you're putting yourself at risk. If you train up for anything and everything's roughly within the hitting arc, then your risk of having a heart attack is less.
Yeah. And, there's probably not a lot of our listeners that have previously had a heart attack, but if people have had a heart attack, is it safe for them to exercise? And what's the process of building back up?
Yeah, so everyone who's had a heart attack should have a heart specialist that oversees their care. But in almost every circumstance, we should be able to get the person back on treatment that enables them to exercise, and to exercise pretty much without limitation. So people who have had a heart attack, not only can they exercise, but we should be able to put them on treatment so that within a fairly short period of time, they can get back into exercise, build it up, and basically exercise without limitation. And same with people that have had heart muscle damage, or what we sometimes call heart failure, where the heart function isn't as good as it should be. Even still, exercise is a really important part of the treatment. So I think there are a few conditions, and there's only a few, where exercise really should be pulled back. In almost every heart condition, not only is it okay, but it actually should be encouraged.
Very good. I'm almost getting to the end. I got a couple of questions to go. And one's about, I guess, cardiologists that aren't used to seeing athletes. Can things potentially be misdiagnosed? And the reason I ask this question is, I remember you saying to me once that a very healthy heart can actually look sick at rest.
Yeah, so people that aren't used to seeing athletes, probably the mistake that I see made the most is actually them interpreting an athlete's heart as being a sick heart. Because they're, really highly trained athletes are so extraordinary. A normal heart, for example, when we measure the volumes of the left ventricle, the main pumping chamber, a normal heart's in the sort of 120 sort of mil range. In a Tour de France cyclist, we've measured 280, 300 mils. So massive, 3 times the size of a normal heart. And because it's so big, it doesn't have to pump as hard to push out as much blood. And so sometimes these people are seen by people who aren't used to seeing athletes and say, oh, there's something really wrong, you should stop your exercise. So a lot of my work is quite enjoyable in saying, look, actually, there's absolutely nothing wrong. Your heart is bang smack in the middle of what we would expect, and we don't see problems with it. Keep going. So I probably see more problems in terms of overdiagnosis of problems that don't exist. But I also do see sometimes people that are less used to seeing athletes kind of falsely reassuring athletes, where they come in and they say, oh, I was running along and I suddenly felt terrible. And the cardiologist will put them on the treadmill. They'll be the fittest person they've ever seen. And they say, look, there can't be anything wrong, because there's this incorrect view that if you're fit enough, you can't have a problem. And that just simply isn't true. There is, in general across society, the really fit people are less likely to have problems and more likely to enjoy good health. But my practice is sometimes finding very serious things with the very fittest athletes. So it just can't be as simple as putting someone on a treadmill and saying, you're really fit, you're okay.
I think that's pretty much it. All the questions. Do you think there's anything that I've sort of missed that the listeners would benefit from hearing?
I don't think so. I guess maybe as a bit of a throwaway thing, I'm not sure what the sort of feedback comes from, but if there are questions that we sort of accumulate over sort of months or whatever, I'd be very happy to do a V 2.0 where we can sit down and have a chat and address some of the questions that come up. Because it's hard to anticipate all of them, and I've definitely learned that some of the best questions that come to me are not at cardiology conferences, but from the general population. So,
thank you.
Thank you to address them.
I might put that offer out to the listeners, and then organise maybe a follow up. But I did have a question just in terms of it's not every day. I don't know many cardiologists, but I've often thought that it's a super high pressure job. You cannot, you're operating on somebody's heart. It's life and death. It's like Moose goes to his shoe shop. He has a bad day. Him having a bad day is him putting a size 10 shoe in a size 9 box. No one's going to die. When you first started out as a cardiologist and you doing surgeries, how nervous are you? Surely it's got to be pretty nerve wracking.
Yeah, it's true. I was actually reflecting on that sort of comment recently, because, but I don't know. I guess it is actually a bit like that analogy of training. If every mouthful that you make is a small incremental one, you do end up taking some pretty big decisions as sort of within your stride, or if you like, sort of thing. It's something to really think about though, because sometimes I think that you're one bad decision away from really kind of the whole thing tumbling down, because there is, you really do go on the journey with your patients, and we all are in fear of something going wrong, and probably something that I think the public understand, but nearly all medical practitioners have their patients' best, wanting them to do well, and wanting to make good decisions. But sometimes we do get it. We can get it wrong, and there's no perfect way of doing things. And that is what I think drives us. It's sort of what drives me to research, is because there's the things that we know and the things we get taught and the things we can get in textbooks. But part of what we do in medicine, for example, some of the issues that you've had are not in textbooks. They're not something that I was taught. It's something that comes about through research and speaking to the very few people around the world that have become interested in this very small niche. Yeah. So, I don't know. Knowledge is power a bit, and the more we learn, the more confident we are with some of the decisions, which can be harder to make.
Yeah, well, that's the one thing I've sort of learned on this journey as well, is that you don't always have the answers, and every situation is different. Because if you told me, well, I felt like in July 2023 that I was pretty much done in terms of ever competing at a decent level again, and then here I am, run a marathon in the last year. So I didn't expect that.
Yeah, and I've got to say I didn't expect it either. I mean, yours is a case of a really, really good result from some good electrophysiology treatment, and it's also a work in progress. We'll see what comes, but you've done extremely well, and that's the fun of being involved.
Yeah. Well, two thank yous. One, thank you for tonight, but also like as much as the heart stuff sort of sucked a year and a half ago, like the positive to come out of it is getting to know you better. So no, thank you for tonight and everything you've done for me over the last 18 months. Like I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brad. And I suppose getting back to one thing is Moose said on Sunday when we went for a bit of a run that this would be completely boring for young people and only interesting to people with walking sticks. So hopefully this has been interesting to a bit of a broader audience than he thought.
I'm sure it will be. I know I went through your whole back catalogue when I was having like issues with mine because I obviously couldn't exercise. So I'm like, I want to know as much about this heart stuff as I can. So I just go into Spotify or Google Andre Gerche and up came all of these different podcasts. I've gone through them all. So no, you're a very knowledgeable man and you speak so well and yeah, appreciate tonight. And yeah, we'll definitely have you back on when we have a few more questions.
Perfect. Thanks Brad.
Andre.
Real
Bye.
pleasure. Cheers.
And I'm gonna hold my head up high. I was taught as a young man, doesn't matter if you're white or black. Just show love to everyone you meet, doesn't matter if it don't come back. Under cover of my skin, I've heard all your names. If it's all the same, I'll keep on walking. Under